There is a room inside the human soul that no one wants to enter. It has no windows, no doors that open from the outside. The walls are made of everything you once believed about yourself, every identity you wore like armor, every story you told to survive, every mask that made you feel safe in a world that never promised safety. And one day, without warning, those walls begin to crack, not because you are weak, but because you are finally becoming real. This is not a room of death, though it feels like one. This is the dying room, the sacred, terrifying space where the old self goes to dissolve so the true self can emerge. Every mystic has spoken of it. Every spiritual tradition has mapped its territory. Every person who has ever truly changed has walked through its shadows. The Buddhists call it ego death. Carl Jung called it the dark night of the soul. Neuroscientists call it neuroplastic reorganization. But the person going through it? They call it hell. Because healing doesn't feel like healing. It feels like dying. Imagine standing at the edge of an abyss and someone tells you that jumping is the only way to fly. Every instinct screams at you to step back, to return to solid ground, to remain who you were. But something deeper, something that existed before your fear, before your name, before your story, whispers that the only way forward is to let go completely, to fall, to die while still breathing. This is the paradox at the heart of all transformation. The self you must become can only be born from the ashes of the self you once were. And the burning? The burning is not punishment. It is purification. Welcome to Season 2 of Echoes of the Ancients. This is When Healing Feels Like Dying. Tonight, we journey into the most profound mystery of human consciousness, the phenomenon of psychological death that precedes authentic rebirth. We will explore why the healing process so often feels like annihilation, why growth demands the dissolution of identity, and why the most transformative moments of human existence require us to die 1,000 deaths before we truly live. We will walk through the neuroscience of collapse, the philosophy of ego death, the mythology of descent, and the psychology of emergence. We will meet the shadows that live in the dying room. We will understand why trauma creates fortresses that must eventually crumble. We will discover what the ancients knew that we have forgotten, that every caterpillar must dissolve completely, liquefying into formless chaos inside the chrysalis before it can reorganize itself into something capable of flight. But be warned, this journey requires honesty. It requires you to look at the parts of yourself you've been avoiding. It requires you to admit that the person you've been protecting might be the very prison keeping you from freedom. Are you ready? Then let us begin where all true transformations begin, in darkness, in uncertainty, in the terrifying recognition that who you thought you were is dying and you cannot stop it. The ghost in the machine. Long before you had language, you had experience. Long before you knew your name, you knew sensation, warmth and cold, comfort and pain, presence and absence. You were born into a world that was too vast, too overwhelming, too incomprehensible for a consciousness as new and fragile as yours. And so, you did what every human consciousness has done since the beginning of our species. You began to build a self. Not the true self. Not yet. That would come later, if you were lucky, if you were brave. No, what you built first was something more urgent. A survival structure. An identity designed not for authenticity, but for protection. A persona that could navigate the dangerous terrain of human existence without being destroyed by it. The ancient Greeks understood this deeply. The word persona comes from the Latin for mask, specifically the masks worn by actors in theatrical performances. Each mask represented a character, a role, a way of being that was not the actor, but something the actor performed. You became an actor in the theater of your own life, often without realizing it. Child psychologists have documented this process with remarkable precision. Watch a young child experience their first significant wound, a parent's absence, a caregiver's anger, a moment of abandonment or shame. Something shifts in that child's eyes. A calculation happens, faster than thought. If I am this way, I am hurt. Therefore I must become another way. And so the mask forms. The obedient child learns to suppress their needs to maintain love. The rebellious child learns to create chaos to feel some sense of control. The invisible child learns to occupy as little space as possible, becoming a ghost in their own home. The perfect child learns that worthiness must be earned through achievement, that love is conditional upon performance. These adaptations are not failures, they are genius. They are how a vulnerable consciousness protects itself from annihilation when it does not yet have the tools to process overwhelming experience. The psychologist Donald Winnicott called this the false self, not because it is dishonest, but because it is constructed. It is the shell that forms around the tender, authentic core, keeping it safe until the world becomes safe enough for that core to emerge. But here is the terrible truth that lies at the heart of all psychological healing. The very adaptations that save you in childhood become the prison that confines you in adulthood. The fortress of the ego. Carl Jung spent his entire life studying the architecture of consciousness. In his exploration of the psyche, he identified what he called the ego, not as Freud conceived it, but as the center of conscious identity. The ego, Jung explained, is the I that you believe yourself to be. It is the narrator of your story, the one who remembers your past and projects your future, the entity that says, I am this and I am not that. The ego is not your enemy. It is not something to be destroyed or transcended carelessly. It is the organizing principle of your conscious life, the filter through which chaos becomes meaning. But the ego is also a builder of walls. Think of it this way. Imagine you are living in a land of constant storms. Lightning strikes without warning. Floods arrive unexpectedly. The wind tears through everything unprotected. What do? You build a fortress. You create thick walls, narrow windows, heavy doors. You build a structure strong enough to withstand the chaos outside. This fortress is your ego identity. It is constructed from your wounds, your beliefs, your strategies for survival. Every time something hurt you, you added another stone to the wall. Every time you learned what was safe and what was dangerous, you reinforced the architecture. I am strong means I cannot show weakness. I am independent means I cannot need anyone. I am in control means I cannot surrender to uncertainty. The walls keep you safe, but they also keep you imprisoned. And here is the devastating irony. The stronger your fortress, the more it costs to maintain it. And the more it costs, the less energy you have left for actually living. Neuroscience has revealed this process at the cellular level. When you experience trauma or chronic stress, your nervous system adapts. The amygdala, your brain's threat detection center, becomes hypervigilant, constantly scanning for danger. The hippocampus, responsible for contextualizing memory, begins to atrophy. Your prefrontal cortex, the seat of higher reasoning and emotional regulation, goes offline during moments of perceived threat. Your entire neurobiology organizes around one imperative: survive. And survival requires rigidity. It requires the same patterns, the same responses, the same walls. Because if the walls have kept you alive this far, changing them feels like death. This is why healing feels like dying. Because healing requires dismantling the fortress. It requires stepping outside the walls you spent your entire life building. It requires exposing the tender parts of yourself that you've protected for so long, allowing them to touch the very air you've been hiding from. The mythological blueprint. The ancients understood what modern psychology is only beginning to rediscover, that transformation always requires descent. Every mythology contains the same essential story, told in different forms across different cultures, yet pointing to the same psychological truth. In Mesopotamian mythology, the goddess Inanna descends into the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal. At each of the 7 gates, she must remove a piece of her divine regalia, her crown, her jewels, her robes. She arrives at the throne of the underworld naked and defenseless. There, she is killed and hung on a hook like a piece of meat. Only after 3 days of death does she return to life, transformed. In Greek mythology, Persephone is dragged into the underworld by Hades. In Egyptian mythology, Osiris is torn apart and must be reassembled. In Christian mysticism, Christ must die before resurrection. In Buddhism, the ego must be recognized as an illusion before enlightenment becomes possible. The pattern repeats endlessly: descent, death, rebirth. Joseph Campbell called this the hero's journey, but it is more than a journey. It is a map of consciousness itself. It is the universal template for how human beings evolve from one state of being to another. The hero begins in the ordinary world, comfortable and known. Then comes the call to adventure, the crisis, the rupture, the moment when the old life becomes impossible to sustain. Initially, the hero refuses. Of course they do. Who would willingly choose to leave safety? But eventually, the threshold must be crossed. The hero enters the unknown, the underworld, the dark forest. There they face trials. They encounter allies and enemies, which, in the internal landscape, are all aspects of themselves. They reach the innermost cave, the place of greatest fear, where the supreme ordeal occurs. And here is the crucial moment. The hero must die to their old identity before they can be reborn, not physically, but psychologically. The person who entered the underworld cannot be the person who emerges. Something essential must be sacrificed. Some cherished belief must be surrendered. Some fundamental story must be recognized as a story and nothing more. This is the death that healing requires. The invitation. You never asked for, no one chooses this consciously. No one wakes up one morning and thinks, "Today seems like a good day to dismantle my entire sense of self." The invitation to the dying room arrives unbidden, often disguised as crisis. A relationship ends, and suddenly the identity you built around being someone's partner dissolves. A career collapses, and the story you told about your success becomes meaningless. An illness arrives, and the body you took for granted reveals its fragility. A loss occurs, of a loved one, of a dream, of innocence, and the world you believed in shatters. Or sometimes the invitation is quieter, an accumulation of small dissatisfactions, a growing sense that the life you're living belongs to someone else, a feeling of numbness, of going through the motions, of wearing a costume that no longer fits. The psychologist James Hollis describes this as the middle passage, the moment when the first half of life's agendas, establishing identity, achieving success, building security, no longer sustain the soul. Something deeper begins to stir. Questions that once seemed abstract become urgent. Who am I beneath all these roles? What do I actually want, not what I've been taught to want? What would I do if I weren't afraid? These questions are dangerous. They threaten the fortress. They suggest that the walls you built for protection have become walls of limitation. They hint at a terrible possibility, that you have been safe but not alive, defended but not free. And so begins the cracking. The fortress doesn't fall all at once. It crumbles gradually, and then suddenly. A belief you held as sacred reveals itself as conditioning. A relationship you thought essential reveals itself as codependent. A pattern you thought was just who you are reveals itself as a trauma response you learned before you had words for what was happening to you. Each revelation is a small death. Each awareness is a piece of regalia removed at the gate. Each awakening is a step deeper into the underworld. And the further you descend, the more it feels like you're losing yourself entirely. Because you are. The question is not whether you will die to your old self. The question is whether you will resist it so fiercely that the dying becomes torture, or surrender to it so completely that the dying becomes transformation. The sensation of dissolving. Let us speak plainly about what happens in the body when the psychological self begins to die. Your heart races without explanation. Your breath becomes shallow. catching in your throat like a trapped bird. Your stomach churns with anxiety that has no clear object. You wake at 3 in the morning, drenched in sweat, haunted by a nameless dread. Your skin feels too tight, or too loose, or not yours at all. This is not metaphor. This is neurobiology. When your identity structure begins to destabilize, your nervous system interprets it as a survival threat, because in a very real sense, it is. The ego is not just a psychological construct. It is encoded in your neural pathways, your muscle memory, your autonomic responses. It is the operating system that has been running your life, and now that operating system is crashing. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his groundbreaking work on trauma, explains that the body keeps the score. Every experience, every adaptation, every defensive pattern is stored not just in memory but in the soma, the living tissue of your being. When healing begins, when those patterns start to shift, the body must recalibrate, and recalibration feels like chaos. The polyvagal theory, developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, maps 3 states of the nervous system: ventral vagal, safe and social; sympathetic, fight or flight; and dorsal vagal, shut down and collapse. In the dying room, you may cycle through all 3 states multiple times in a single day. One moment, you're fighting, angry at the world, angry at yourself, angry at the process. The next moment, you're fleeing, desperate to escape your own mind, seeking any distraction, any substance, any behavior that will numb the intensity. And then, without warning, you collapse into shutdown, numbness, dissociation, the sense that you're watching your life from behind glass. This is what healing feels like in the body, a civil war between the part of you that is trying to change and the part of you that is terrified of change. The resistance. The dying room is entered reluctantly, but once inside, the resistance becomes absolute. Every defense mechanism you've ever developed activates simultaneously. It's as if your psyche has pulled every alarm, deployed every soldier, raised every drawbridge. Because from the perspective of the ego, what's happening is not healing, it's annihilation. Resistance takes many forms, and it is sophisticated beyond measure. Denial. This isn't really happening. I'm fine. Everything is fine. I just need to push through, work harder, think more positively. The mind creates elaborate stories to explain away the cracking, to minimize the magnitude of what's occurring. Rationalization. This is just stress. This is just hormones. This is just a phase. There's a logical explanation that doesn't require me to change everything about my life. The intellect becomes a weapon used against deeper knowing. Bargaining. I'll change this one thing, but not that. I'll work on this issue, but not that one. I'll heal the surface, but I don't need to go deep. You try to negotiate with the process, to control the uncontrollable, to undergo transformation on your terms. Regression. You return to old patterns with renewed intensity. The addiction you quit resurfaces. The relationship dynamic you were escaping reasserts itself. The coping mechanism you thought you'd outgrown becomes your lifeline again. Not because you're weak, but because familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar growth. Spiritual bypassing. You learn the language of healing without doing the work. You collect insights like trophies. You speak about consciousness and awakening while avoiding the actual descent. You try to transcend the human experience without fully experiencing it. The psychologist Carl Rogers observed that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. But acceptance is the one thing the resisting ego cannot do. To accept that the old self is dying is to stop fighting, and to stop fighting feels like surrender, and surrender feels like death. The shadow work. Here we must speak of Jung's most profound and disturbing contribution to psychology, the concept of the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not the dark side of the force. It is something far more complex and far more human. It is everything you've disowned about yourself in order to maintain your ego identity. Think back to childhood. You learned quickly what was acceptable and what was not. Anger was punished, so you learned to be nice. Vulnerability was mocked, so you learned to be strong. Neediness was burdensome, so you learned to be independent. Wildness was dangerous, so you learned to be controlled. Every time you rejected a part of yourself to fit the mold of who you were supposed to be, that rejected part didn't disappear. It went into the shadow. It became part of the unconscious, operating beneath your awareness, influencing your behavior in ways you couldn't see. The shadow contains your repressed emotions, your forbidden desires, your unacceptable needs, your exiled creativity, your denied power. It holds everything that doesn't fit the story you tell about yourself, and the shadow always, eventually, demands to be acknowledged. In the dying room, the shadow emerges with force. All the parts you've denied begin to surface. You discover rage you didn't know you were carrying. You encounter needs you've been ashamed of. You meet aspects of yourself you find repulsive. You see the ways you've hurt others while believing yourself blameless. You recognize patterns you swore you'd never repeat, but have been repeating all along. This is the supreme ordeal of the hero's journey. Not facing an external monster, but facing the monster within, and realizing that it's not a monster at all. It's just the parts of you that were exiled so long ago you forgot they were yours. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the work that cannot be skipped. This is the descent that must be completed. You must meet your shadow. You must recognize it. You must, in some profound way, integrate it, not act it out, but acknowledge it, understand it, reclaim the energy you've been using to suppress it. And this integration is excruciating, because it means admitting things about yourself that violate your self-concept. It means seeing the ways you've been complicit in your own suffering. It means taking responsibility for patterns you've blamed on others. It means owning your power in situations where it felt safer to play the victim. The ego would rather die than admit these things, and so, in a sense, it must. The dark night of the soul. The Christian mystic St. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation where God seems absent, faith crumbles, and the seeker is left in absolute darkness. For centuries, this was understood as a religious experience, but the dark night is not merely religious. It is psychological, it is archetypal, it is the universal experience of ego death that occurs when the old structures of meaning collapse and new structures have not yet formed. In the dark night, nothing makes sense anymore. The beliefs that once oriented you seem hollow. The goals that once motivated you seem pointless. The relationships that once sustained you feel superficial. The identity that once defined you feels like a costume you can no longer wear. You look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back, not because your face has changed, but because you no longer know who that face belongs to. This is the void. This is the gap between selves. This is the liquefaction inside the chrysalis, where the caterpillar's body completely dissolves before reorganizing into butterfly form. And here is what no one tells you about the dark night. You cannot think your way through it. The intellect, which has been your primary tool for navigating reality, becomes useless here. Analysis doesn't help. Understanding doesn't help. Even knowing that this is a necessary stage of transformation doesn't help, because knowing is not the same as enduring. You must simply be in it, feel it, survive it, breathe through it. Trust that somewhere beneath the dissolution, something new is forming, even though you can't see it, can't feel it, can't believe it. The dark night demands faith of a different kind, not faith in a deity or a doctrine, but faith in the process itself. Faith that evolution is occurring even in the absence of evidence. Faith that dying to the old self is not the end of the story. But faith is hard when you're in the dark, and the dark can last longer than you think you can endure. The voices of sabotage. As you sit in the dying room, Voices arise, not literal voices, but the internalized messages that have shaped your psyche. These are the voices of sabotage, the parts of you that would rather you stay small, stay safe, stay the same, even if it means staying in pain. The inner critic. You're doing this wrong. You're too damaged. You're too broken. Real people don't fall apart like this. Strong people don't need help. You're weak. You're pathetic. You're never going to get better. The perfectionist. If you're going to heal, you need to do it perfectly. You need to read all the right books, find the right therapist, follow the right protocol. You can't make mistakes. Any setback means you've failed completely. The skeptic. This is all nonsense. Healing is just new age wishful thinking. You're wasting your time. The best you can hope for is to manage your symptoms and get through each day. True change is impossible. The fearful child. Don't go any deeper. It's not safe. If you feel everything you've been avoiding, it will destroy you. Stay numb. Stay protected. The pain is too much. The savior. You don't need to heal yourself. You need to save everyone else. Focus on their problems, not yours. Your worth comes from being needed, from fixing others, from sacrificing yourself. These voices are not your enemies. They are not aberrations. They are strategies that once served you, now outliving their usefulness. They are the guardians at the gates, testing whether you're truly ready for transformation or whether you'll turn back to the familiar suffering. And the test is brutal, because sometimes, in the depths of the dying room, these voices become so loud that they drown out everything else. The small, quiet voice of your authentic self, the one whispering that you must continue, that this is necessary, that something precious waits on the other side, becomes nearly impossible to hear. This is when people turn back. This is when the healing process aborts, not because they're weak, but because the pressure becomes too great and the voices of sabotage too convincing. But there is another possibility. There is the possibility of continuing anyway, of moving forward not because you believe you'll make it, but because going back is no longer an option, of taking one more breath, one more step, one more day in the dying room, because something in you, something older and wiser than your fear, knows that this is the way. The loneliness of transformation. One of the cruelest aspects of the dying room is its solitude. Even if you're surrounded by people, even if you have support, even if you have a therapist or a community or loved ones who care, the actual process of ego death is profoundly, devastatingly alone. Because no one can do this for you. No one can meet your shadow for you. No one can dissolve your ego for you. No one can endure your dark night for you. They can witness, they can hold space, they can offer compassion, but they cannot walk through the dying room in your place. And more than that, the people in your life are invested in the old you, not maliciously, not consciously, but they know that version of you. They've learned how to relate to that version. Your relationships have been built around the dynamics of your former self. When you begin to change, when you begin to die to that old self, it threatens the entire system. Your transformation requires others to transform in relation to you, and not everyone is ready for that. Some relationships will end, some friendships will fade, some people will become uncomfortable with your growth and will consciously or unconsciously try to pull you back into old patterns. This is not betrayal, this is nature. Systems seek homeostasis. When one part changes, the whole system must reorganize or break apart. But knowing this intellectually doesn't make it easier. The loneliness of transformation is real. You may find yourself unable to explain what you're going through to anyone who hasn't been through it themselves. You may feel like an alien in your own life, watching people engage with concerns that no longer resonate, speaking a language you no longer speak. The mythologist Michael Meade writes about the threshold experience, the liminal space where you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. In tribal cultures, initiates undergoing transformation were often isolated from the community, taken into the wilderness, stripped of their former identity, and left to face the ordeal alone. Modern society offers no such structure. We are expected to undergo radical transformation while maintaining our jobs, our responsibilities, our social facades. We are expected to die and be reborn without anyone noticing. And so we suffer in silence. We smile through the dissolution. We pretend to be functioning while internally we're being unmade, until we can't pretend anymore. Until the facade cracks so completely that hiding becomes impossible. And sometimes, that complete breaking is exactly what's needed. The wisdom of breakdown. Western psychology has long pathologized psychological breakdown. A crisis is something to be medicated, managed, resolved as quickly as possible. Get the person back to baseline, restore functioning, eliminate symptoms. But what if breakdown is not the problem? What if breakdown is the solution? The psychiatrist Stanislav Grof coined the term spiritual emergency to describe psychological crises that, while appearing pathological, are actually opportunities for profound transformation. He observed that many people hospitalized for psychotic breaks or extreme psychological states were actually in the midst of breakthrough experiences, the dissolution of old structures making way for new ones. The British psychiatrist R.D. Laing went even further, suggesting that what we call mental illness is often a sane response to insane circumstances. The person who breaks down in an oppressive, soul-crushing environment is not sick, they are responding authentically to sickness. The breakdown is the beginning of health, not the expression of disease. In Eastern traditions, this understanding is embedded in the philosophy. The Buddhist concept of dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it more accurately means unsatisfactoriness, the fundamental dissatisfaction that arises from clinging to impermanent things, including the illusion of a fixed self. The path to liberation requires seeing through this illusion, which necessitates a kind of death to the ego's agenda. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is not just a guide for physical death, but a map of psychological transformation. It describes the bardos, the intermediate states between one form of existence and another. In the dying room, you are in a bardo, no longer your old self, not yet your new self, suspended in the terrifying emptiness between identities. And the text's guidance is clear. Do not cling, do not resist. Recognize the visions and experiences as projections of your own mind. Allow the dissolution to complete itself. Because the wisdom of breakdown is this: sometimes things must fall completely apart before they can reorganize at a higher level of complexity. In chaos theory, this is called emergence. In alchemy, it's called nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the necessary death that precedes the transformation of lead into gold. In ecology, it's called succession. How a forest fire, devastating as it is, clears the way for new growth that couldn't occur in the forest's previous state. You are not falling apart randomly. You are falling apart precisely so you can come together differently. But you have to trust the falling. You have to let the fortress crumble. You have to allow the breakdown to take you all the way down before the breakthrough can occur. And here, in the deepest part of the dying room, where the ego has exhausted itself fighting, where the old self has finally, mercifully released its grip, here is where the transformation actually begins. The moment of surrender. There comes a moment, sudden or gradual, obvious or subtle, when the fight ends. Not because you've won, not because you've figured everything out, not because the pain has stopped or the fear has vanished or the uncertainty has resolved, but because you can't fight anymore. Because resistance has exhausted itself, because you've finally, completely, utterly reached the end of your own strategies, your own control, your own ability to manage the unmanageable. And in that moment of absolute exhaustion, something unexpected happens. You surrender, not as a conscious choice, not as a noble decision, but as the only thing left when everything else has failed. You stop trying to make yourself heal faster. You stop comparing yourself to others' timelines. You stop analyzing what's wrong with you. You stop searching for the perfect solution, the right technique, the magic words that will make this all stop. You simply let go. And in that letting go, the dying room transforms. The mystics across traditions have pointed to this moment as the crucial turning point. What Christians call grace, Buddhists call emptying, Taoists call wu wei, psychologists call radical acceptance. It is the shift from doing to being, from controlling to allowing, from resisting what is to inhabiting it fully. Eckhart Tolle writes, "Surrender is the simple but profound wisdom of yielding to, rather than opposing the flow of life. But this wisdom is only accessed after every other option has been exhausted. The paradox is absolute. You cannot surrender until you've fully fought. You cannot let go until you've fully held on. You cannot die to the ego until the ego has spent itself completely trying to survive. This is why the process cannot be rushed. This is why there are no shortcuts. The ego must exhaust every strategy before it will finally, reluctantly, impossibly, trust. Trust what? It doesn't even know. Trust the void. Trust the process. Trust that something beyond its understanding is unfolding, something that doesn't require its management or control. And in that trust, however fragile, however tentative, the first light enters the dying room. The return of sensation. After months or years of numbness, of dissociation, of feeling like you're living behind glass, suddenly, without warning, you feel something. Not the overwhelming chaos of the breakdown, not the crushing weight of the dark night, but something simpler, smaller, more genuine. You're walking outside, and the sunlight on your skin doesn't just warm you, you actually feel it. The breeze carries a scent, earth, rain, flowers, and for the first time in forever you notice. A song plays, and something in your chest moves. Not dramatically, just moves. You're crying, but the tears are different. Not the desperate, choking sobs of dissolution, but something softer, cleaner. You're crying because you can feel again. You're crying because you're alive. This is the first sign of emergence. Neuroscience explains this as the nervous system recalibrating. The hypervigilance begins to soften. The amygdala quiets. The prefrontal cortex comes back online. The body, having lived in survival mode for so long, begins to remember that there are states beyond survival, but the experience is more profound than biology. What's returning is not just sensation, but presence, the ability to be here, now in this moment, without the layers of defense and dissociation that have been insulating you from direct experience. You begin to notice details you've been blind to, the way light moves through water, the complexity of a stranger's face, the taste of food, actual taste, not just the mechanical consumption of calories, the sound of your own voice, and the realization that it's been months since you really listened to it. Small things, ordinary things, things that were always there but invisible to the self that was too busy fortifying its walls. The poet Mary Oliver asked, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" But you couldn't answer that question in the dying room. You were too consumed with simply surviving it. Now, emerging, you begin to understand the question differently. Your life has always been wild and precious. You just couldn't feel it beneath all the armor. The reconstruction of self. Here is what happens after ego death. The self reorganizes, not as a return to who you were. You can never go back. The old neural pathways, the old stories, the old identity structures, they've been dismantled. Some can be reconstructed, but they'll never be the same. They've been touched by awareness. They've been seen for what they are, constructions, useful fictions, but not ultimate truths. The new self that emerges is more flexible, more spacious, more real. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the reconciliation of opposites, the embodiment of the self beyond the ego. It's not about destroying the ego, but right-sizing it, recognizing it as one part of the psyche rather than the totality. In practical terms, this means you still have an identity. You still have preferences, values, patterns, but you're less identified with them. You can hold them more lightly. When someone criticizes you, it doesn't shatter you, because you're not as fused with the story they're criticizing. You still have emotions, but they move through you more fluidly. You can feel anger without becoming it, experience sadness without drowning in it, touch joy without clinging to it. You still have wounds. The trauma doesn't disappear, but it's no longer running your life from the unconscious. You've met it, acknowledged it, integrated its wisdom. The wound becomes a source of compassion rather than a source of shame. You still have relationships, but they're more authentic. You're no longer performing a role, maintaining a facade, pretending to be who you think others need you to be. You can show up as you actually are, messy, complicated, human. You still have purpose, but it's not the driven, desperate purpose of the ego trying to prove its worth. It's a deeper purpose, connected to something larger than yourself, flowing from a place of presence rather than lack. This is not perfection. This is not a rival. This is not the end of all struggle. This is simply being more fully yourself, with all the imperfection, all the contradiction, all the glorious mess of what it means to be human. The Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, writes, "To be fully alive, fully human, and completely awake is to be continually thrown out of the nest." The awakening is not a permanent state of bliss. It's an ongoing practice of returning to presence, again and again, even as life continues to unsettle us. But there's a fundamental difference. You know now that you can survive the unsettling. You've been to the dying room and emerged. You've met the dissolution and reorganized. You've touched the void and discovered that it's not empty, it's full of potential. The integration of shadow. Remember the shadow? All those disowned parts, those rejected aspects, those uncomfortable truths about yourself. In the emergence phase, something remarkable happens. You begin to reclaim them, not by acting them out unconsciously, but by integrating them consciously. The anger you suppressed becomes healthy assertion. The vulnerability you denied becomes authentic connection. The neediness you were ashamed of becomes the capacity to ask for and receive support. The wildness you tamed becomes creative power. The darkness you feared becomes depth. This is the alchemical transformation, lead into gold. Not because the lead stops being led, but because you recognize that lead and gold are the same substance at different stages of evolution. You begin to understand that you are not good or bad, light or dark, healthy or sick. You are all of it, a spectrum, a paradox, a human being containing multitudes, as Walt Whitman knew. The perfectionism that drove you to exhaustion. It also gave you discipline and excellence. The people-pleasing that kept you small. It also gave you empathy and attunement. The control that isolated you. It also gave you strength and resilience. Nothing was ever purely pathological. Everything served a purpose. Everything deserves acknowledgement. And when you can hold both sides, the gift and the cost, the light and the shadow, the wound and the wisdom, you become whole. Not perfect. Whole. Jung wrote, "I'd rather be whole than good." This is the statement of someone who has integrated their shadow, someone who has stopped pretending to be only their acceptable parts and has embraced the totality of their humanity. This wholeness is what others feel when they're in your presence now. You're no longer performing. You're no longer hiding. You're no longer trying to be anything other than what you are. And paradoxically, this authenticity, this willingness to be fully human, is what allows you to connect most deeply with others. Because everyone is carrying their own shadow. Everyone is hiding parts of themselves, and when they encounter someone who has stopped hiding, who has integrated their darkness, it gives them permission to do the same. You become, without trying, a permission slip for others' wholeness. The new relationship with pain. One of the most profound shifts after ego death is how you relate to pain. Before, pain was the enemy, something to avoid, to numb, to escape. Your entire life structure was organized around not feeling certain things, not acknowledging certain truths, not touching certain wounds. But in the dying room, you learned something crucial. Pain is not fatal. You felt everything you were afraid to feel. You touched the wounds you were terrified would destroy you. You experienced the dissolution you were certain you couldn't survive. And you're still here, not unchanged, not unscathed, but here. And this changes everything. Now, when pain arises, and it will, because you're alive, you don't immediately contract in fear. You don't immediately reach for a defense mechanism or a distraction or a way out. Instead, you breathe, you feel. You allow the pain to be present without it defining you. This is not masochism. This is not glorifying suffering. This is simply the recognition that pain is part of the human experience, and resisting it creates more suffering than allowing it. The Buddha's second noble truth states that the cause of suffering is attachment, which includes attachment to avoiding pain. The more we fight against what is, the more we suffer. The more we can be with what is, even when it's painful, the less we suffer. This doesn't mean you don't take action to change what can be changed. It means you don't add the layer of suffering that comes from refusing to acknowledge what's actually happening. You cry when you need to cry. You grieve when you need to grieve. You feel your feelings fully, without judgment, without the story that something is wrong with you for feeling them. And in that allowing, something miraculous happens. The pain moves through you more quickly. It doesn't get stuck. It doesn't become chronic. It arises, peaks, and passes like a wave. You begin to trust your own emotional resilience. You know now, from direct experience, that you can handle what life brings. Not because you're invincible, but because you're flexible. Not because you're strong in the ego sense, but because you're strong in the way bamboo is strong, able to bend without breaking. The gift in the wound. There's an old Sufi story. A man goes to a therapist and says, "I'm terrified of death. I can't stop thinking about it. It's ruining my life." The therapist says, "What if your fear of death is actually your love of life trying to get your attention? Every wound carries a gift, not because suffering is noble, not because we should be grateful for trauma, but because the psyche is remarkably efficient. It creates symptoms that point directly to what needs healing. Your anxiety? It's not random. It's your nervous system's way of saying, we're not safe yet. Something needs to change. Your depression? It's not weakness. It's your soul's way of saying, this life we're living is not aligned with who we truly are. We need to grieve what's lost and reimagine what's possible. Your addictions? They're not moral failures. They're your attempt to soothe unbearable pain, to create moments of relief, to escape what feels inescapable. They're your wounded self's best effort at survival. Every symptom is a messenger. Every breakdown is information. Every crisis is an invitation. The question is whether you can receive the gift without resenting the wrapping. In the dying room, you couldn't. The pain was too immediate, too overwhelming, too consuming. But now emerging, you can look back and see that relationship that ended. It freed you from a dynamic that was slowly killing your spirit. That job you lost. It released you from a life path that was never truly yours. That illness that brought you to your knees. It taught you what actually matters, stripping away everything superficial. That trauma that shattered you. It cracked you open in a way that allows light to enter, allows authenticity to emerge, allows compassion to flow, for yourself and for others. The gift is not that the wounding happened. The gift is what you became by metabolizing the wound, by transforming it from trauma to wisdom. The Japanese art of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold, making the breaks visible and beautiful rather than hidden. The vessel becomes more valuable because it's been broken and repaired. You are kintsugi. The cracks are visible. The gold is your awareness, your compassion, your hard-won wisdom. You're more beautiful, more valuable, more real than you were before you broke. Not despite the breaking, because of it. the evolution of consciousness. Let us zoom out from the personal to the collective, from the individual to the species. What you've experienced in the dying room is not just your personal journey. It's a pattern that repeats at every scale of existence. Cells die so organisms can live. Old growth forests burn so new ecosystems can emerge. Species evolve through extinction events. Civilizations collapse so new cultures can arise. Stars die in supernovas, seeding the universe with elements that become new worlds. Death and rebirth are the fundamental rhythm of existence itself. But something unique is happening in human consciousness right now, in this moment of history. We are living through a collective dark night of the soul. The old stories that organized human civilization are crumbling. The myths of endless progress, infinite growth, human dominion over nature, the supremacy of reason over feeling, the separation of mind from body, individual from collective, humanity from nature, all of these are being questioned, challenged, dismantled. And it's terrifying. On a collective scale, we're experiencing what you experienced personally, the sensation that everything is falling apart, that the old structures can't hold, that we're descending into chaos. Climate crisis, political polarization, mental health epidemics, meaning crises, the rise of AI and the question of what it means to be human, the dissolution of traditional institutions and the uncertainty of what replaces them. We are in the dying room together, and the temptation, collectively, is the same as it was personally, to resist, to cling to the old forms, to try to restore what was, to make things normal again. But what if normal was the problem? What if the old structures needed to collapse? What if we're not witnessing the end of humanity, but its transformation? The philosopher Ken Wilber speaks of evolution occurring through transcend and include. Each new level of consciousness doesn't reject the previous level, but integrates it into something more complex, more inclusive, more aware. We're not going backwards, we're going through. And just like your personal emergence, the collective emergence requires first going through the complete dissolution, the dark night, the ego death, in this case, the death of the human ego that believed itself separate from and superior to the rest of existence. What emerges on the other side? We don't fully know yet. We're still in the chrysalis. But we can sense possibilities. A consciousness that recognizes interconnection as fundamental. That sees the web of life not as metaphor, but as reality. That understands that harming any part of the system harms the whole. A way of being that integrates rather than fragments, mind and body, reason and intuition, technology and nature, individual and collective, masculine and feminine, all the false dichotomies we've been living in. A relationship with the planet based not on extraction, but on reciprocity. Not on dominion, but on partnership. Not on conquest, but on belonging. A society that values psychological and spiritual growth as much as economic growth. That creates spaces for initiation, for healing, for transformation. That understands the dying room as sacred space rather than pathology. This is not naive optimism. This is evolutionary necessity. We're being forced to evolve because the old ways are literally destroying us. The ego death is happening whether we choose it or not. The only question is whether we surrender to it consciously or resist it into catastrophe. Your personal healing matters because it's a fractal of the collective healing. Every person who goes through the dying room and emerges more whole, more conscious, more integrated contributes to the collective transformation. You are not just healing yourself. You are participating in the evolution of consciousness itself. The return with the treasure. In the hero's journey, the final stage is the return. The hero, transformed by the ordeal, must return to the ordinary world, bringing back the treasure, the wisdom, the elixir, the boon that benefits not just themselves, but their community. You have been to the underworld. You have died to your old self. You have faced your shadow, surrendered your control, dissolved your ego. You have touched the void and discovered that it's not empty but generative. And now you return, but you're not returning to the same life. You can't. You're not the same person. The relationships that were built around your old self will need to evolve or end. The work that was tolerable to your defended self may become intolerable to your authentic self. The habits, the patterns, the environments that supported who you were may no longer serve who you're becoming. This is not easy. The return is its own challenge. There's a reason many mythological heroes struggle with the return. They've seen beyond the veil, touched something vast and mysterious, and the ordinary world feels confining. But this is where the treasure matters. The wisdom you've gained is not meant to keep you separate from life, but to help you engage with it more fully, more consciously, more compassionately. You return with the knowledge that everyone around you is also fighting battles you can't see. Everyone is also carrying wounds. Everyone is also doing the best they can with the consciousness they have. This knowledge becomes compassion. You return with the understanding that authenticity is more valuable than approval. That being true to yourself, even when it disappoints others, is the only way to live with integrity. This understanding becomes courage. You return with the recognition that you are not your thoughts, not your emotions, not your story, that you are the awareness beneath all of those, vast, spacious, unbreakable. This recognition becomes freedom. You return with the experience of having died and been reborn, and this experience becomes the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that transformation is possible, that no matter how stuck, how broken, how lost you feel, evolution is available, change is real, healing happens, and you become, simply by existing in this knowing, an invitation for others to begin their own journey into the dying room, not through preaching, not through telling them what to do, but through embodiment, through presence, through the quiet confidence of someone who has been through the fire and discovered that what burns away is only what was never truly you. The treasure you bring back is yourself, more fully, more authentically, more courageously yourself than you've ever been. So we arrive, together, at the end of this exploration. But endings are always beginnings, aren't they? Let me tell you the truth that the ego death reveals and that every emergence confirms. Healing never feels like healing while it's happening. It feels like dying because, in every meaningful sense, you are dying. The self you've known, the identity you've constructed, the fortress you've maintained, all of it must crumble for something more authentic to emerge. And this is not a one-time event. This is the rhythm of a conscious life. You will visit the dying room again. Not because you failed, not because you didn't heal properly the first time, but because evolution is ongoing. Each level of consciousness you reach becomes the foundation for the next transformation. Each self you become will eventually need to die so the next self can emerge. Life will continue to offer you initiations, relationships that challenge you, losses that devastate you, failures that humble you, successes that reveal your shadows, moments of crisis that force you to let go of what you thought you knew. And each time, you'll have the choice: resist or surrender, fight or allow, try to restore the old or trust the emergence of the new. The difference now is that you know what lies on the other side of dying. You've been there. You've touched the dissolution and survived it. You've met the void and discovered its generative. You've experienced ego death and found that what remains after the ego dies is more real than anything the ego ever claimed to be. This knowing changes everything. It means you can approach future crises not as catastrophes, but as transformations. Not as punishments, but as invitations. Not as endings, but as transitions. It means you can hold your identity more lightly, knowing it's just one configuration of consciousness, useful but not ultimate. It means you can embrace the paradox, that you are both a constructed self navigating the social world and a vast awareness that cannot be contained by any construction, that you are human and being simultaneously, that you are the wave and the ocean, The philosopher Alan Watts once said, "The meaning of life is just to be alive. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple. And yet, everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. What you achieve in the dying room is the recognition that you don't need to achieve anything to be worthy of existence. You already are. You always have been. The ego spent your entire life trying to earn what was always freely given, the right to be here, to take up space, to matter. And when that recognition lands, not as an idea but as a lived experience, everything shifts. You stop performing and start being. You stop seeking and start finding, because you realize that what you were seeking was never outside you. You stop becoming and start arriving, because you recognize that you were never actually lost. This is the awakening that follows the dying, not a mystical transcendence of the human condition, not an escape from the challenges of existence, not a permanent state of bliss or enlightenment, but a simpler, more profound shift. The ability to be fully present with whatever is arising, without needing it to be different. The capacity to meet life as it is, not as you wish it were. The freedom to be yourself completely, without apology or pretense. I want to leave you with a question, not to answer now, but to carry with you. What would your life look like if you stopped protecting yourself from transformation and started trusting it? What would change if you saw every crisis as an invitation rather than a catastrophe? What would open if you allowed yourself to die to old identities instead of clinging to them? What would emerge if you trusted the dissolution instead of fearing it? These are not hypothetical questions. These are the questions that will determine the trajectory of your evolution. These are the questions that, when truly lived rather than merely considered, transform everything. Because here's what I've learned, what the ancients knew, what the dying room teaches. You are not here to stay the same. You are not here to be comfortable. You are not here to avoid pain or maintain control or preserve your current sense of self. You are here to evolve, to expand, to become more fully who you actually are beneath all the conditioning and fear and protective strategies. You are here to be broken open so that what's been trapped inside can finally emerge. You are here to die repeatedly to false versions of yourself so that the truth of who you are can be born. And yes, this will feel like dying, because it is dying, but it's also the only way to truly live. Thank you for walking through the dying room with me tonight. Thank you for your courage in facing these truths. Thank you for your willingness to sit with the discomfort, the questions, the uncertainty. Remember, healing feels like dying because you are dying, to illusions, to limitations, to the small self that could never contain the vastness of who you actually are. And what emerges from that dying is more real, more alive, more free than anything that came before. Trust the process, trust the dissolution, trust that you are not falling apart. You are falling together in a new way. This is Echoes of the Ancients, reminding you that the wisdom you seek is not in avoiding the dying room, but in surrendering to it completely. Until we meet again in the next exploration of consciousness, may you find the courage to let yourself die again and again, so you can truly live.